When you talk about socialism, I go back to the Margaret Thatcher line. Socialism is a wonderful system until you run out of other people's money.
Hey, your capitalist utopia there is $38 trillion in debt. Debt, or borrowed money, well, that's just another name for other people's money, isn't it? Reportedly, your entire economic system is teetering on the brink of insolvency. And well, another way of saying that would be, it seems like you're running out of other people's money. So whose money is it? Well, that's a complicated question because it's a complicated Ponzi scheme. Economic system. Using violence and financial and political corruption to actively prevent developing countries from actually developing in order to cheaply access their resources is certainly a factor, but, you're not running out of that one, are you? Another factor is using the threat of murder at the hands of your global defense force to force countries to comply and agree to trade in your currency. Now, this means they have to keep buying your currency in order to do trade, which creates a perpetual demand for your currency, which means that your government can create more of your currency out of thin air without it losing all of its value. Now, this accounts for like 30% of the US government's annual budget. That's how they pay their bills, by creating money out of thin air. All made possible by the perpetual threat of violence and the occasional actual delivery of violence against countries that try to refuse to participate. Which is why you have like over 1,000 overseas military bases and the rest of the world has like 30. Like combined, the whole rest of the world's overseas military bases combined is 30. But it's because you're protecting us all, right? Because of how aggressive everybody else is. Now, this one, you kind of are beginning to run out of. Not only because the prospect of actually investing in owning your debt is becoming way less attractive due to concerns of how bloated this bubble can become before it eventually becomes totally unsustainable, but also because the threat seems to be beginning to wear a little thin. Here's your Secretary of State Marco Rubio lamenting over that fact.
Today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States.
How dare they? Can you imagine two of the biggest economies in the world who are in a trade alliance with each other having the nerve to do trade with each other without giving you a little taste, a little kickback in exchange for the privilege? The level of entitlement here knows no bounds. You not only feel entitled to try and force the world to perpetually subsidize your economy, but you feel entitled to enact violence against countries if they try to refuse. Now, another place the money is being borrowed from is kind of your own future. In a very real way, the consumer capitalist growth enjoyed by previous generations was borrowed out of the pockets of their own children. This is kind of how a loan works in general. If you go to a bank and get a loan, they don't give you their own money. They give you credit money. They create new money out of thin air. Now, when you pay back the loan, the principal, the initial amount that you borrowed, is removed out of circulation, and the bank is left with the interest that you paid along the way. Which means that credit money is kind of backed by the promise of your future labor. The promise that you're going to do the work that creates the value of the money that you borrowed retroactively in order to pay it back. So you've borrowed money from your own future at a slight loss, which is the interest. Now, a government borrowing money is not entirely dissimilar, except the value that they're borrowing against is the collective labor of their entire population. They're borrowing against their country's own future productivity. Now, the increased productivity actually happens. The problem is, if the entire economy is set up in a way that funnels all the money into corporate coffers and then gives the corporations infinite loopholes in order to avoid paying their taxes, well, then the money never makes it back to the government. It never pays back the debt. It never comes out of circulation. And the government just keeps increasing the debt to pay its own bills and increasing interest, which keeps increasing the money supply and therefore devaluing the money supply and therefore devaluing the labor and the productivity of future generations. So now that younger people are trying to tax the rich and change the system because they are struggling to survive, it's because the value of their labor has already been spent and managed in a way that benefits the ultra-wealthy. They're not asking for a handout. They're asking for their money back.